Wherever you're watching, welcome to the show. Now, the cost of food is something all of us need to worry about. From America to Australia, from Chile to China, every corner of the world has, over the last few years, felt the impact of major global events like the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. They've felt that in the price of their weekly shop. And once again, prices are beginning to creep higher. The UN's food price index shows how costs hit a record high shortly after the war in Ukraine started, underlining its importance in exporting food to the rest of the world. And whilst prices then fell back, they're now 8.2% higher than they were a year ago. Now, partly it's because prices for basics have been volatile. Coffee and dairy have risen, whilst grain prices have fallen. The range of reasons include unusual weather and uncertainty around global trade. Now, the biggest impact is always on those with the least money. Nigeria, Kenya and Bangladesh are all countries where more than half of household spending goes on food, whereas in the US, UK and Switzerland, it's less than 10%. But food prices are a political issue too. This was Donald Trump on the campaign trail last year.
One of my top priorities will be to quickly defeat inflation. It'll also bring your grocery bill way down. I have more complaints on grocery. The word grocery, it's sort of simple word, but it sort of means like everything you eat. The stomach is speaking. It always does.
He's since conceded it's hard to bring things down once they're up. And that's been seen in the way inflation continues to be pushed up by higher food prices in the US and other parts of the world. And whilst consumers always want to spend less, on the other side are the farmers, whose income depends on what we pay for their produce, and whose work is essential to making sure there's enough food to go around. In December, the President of the European Commission announced a new trade deal with a group of South American countries that would expose EU farmers to greater competition.
This will create huge business opportunities. And to our farmers, we have heard you, listened to your concerns, and we are acting on them. This agreement includes robust safeguards to protect your livelihoods.
But it's the US that's the world's biggest food exporter. Its farmers could feel pain from other countries responding to President Trump's tariffs. At a time when the US is importing more food than ever, tariffs could make it harder for farmers elsewhere too, as this Californian vegetable farmer explains.
Any type of tariff or trade war, there's winners and losers. Concern on fertilizer price and some of our inputs, if those increase, that's going to put a damper on things. That's going to increase our cost. Products coming in that we compete with, yes, maybe that raises the market somewhat. But again, there's winners and losers, and to see how it all plays out, there's a lot of unknowns at this point in time.
So how might all this uncertainty play out, and why is the cost of some food going up whilst other prices go down? To explain that, I've been speaking to the chief economist of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Maximo Colin, good to have you on the programme. And your report shows, doesn't it, that food prices have risen by 8.2% over the year, but that in itself hides some disparities. Just explain that for us.
So essentially, we have to be very careful when we refer to food prices, because one thing is the prices of the food that you consume, and those are still increasing. And there are several elements in addition to the food commodities that compose that price. For example, you need energy, you need other inputs to produce the food you buy in a supermarket. In the case of FAO, we also follow the commodity prices, and those are the core commodities like wheat, maize, corn. But for example, when you consume bread, the production of bread only have 2% of wheat in the production of bread. So we need to add all those other elements, which is including energy, that will increase potentially the prices. What we are observing today is that the commodity prices of wheat, maize, corn are stabilizing and going down and stable, but the prices of food still are not going down at the velocity we would like, and in some cases are increasing. The more poor the country you are, the less the transmission downward we are facing in terms of final food prices.
So things like coffee and sugar, they're going up in price, but at the same time, things like grain are coming down. Why that difference? What's driving that?
No, in the case of coffee, for example, the issue is different. Is that there are some climate issues that had affected some countries through different pests and diseases, but also production of, especially in Africa, which have restricted the supply of coffee. The same happened with cocoa. In the case of cereals, which we are talking of wheat, maize, and soybeans, we have seen that the supplies have been very stable in the last months and in the last years. after the spike that happened during the COVID-19 and also the war in Ukraine. Now, why the supplies are stable? Because commodities are moving out of Ukraine and Russian Federation, but also other countries like Brazil, Argentina, and the US have been producing and have good supplies this year, which has assured that there is enough supplies.
Now, just as we get over some of those disruptions, the tariffs announced by President Trump could reshape the way that the world trades, particularly when it comes to things like food. What impact could they have?
Look, it's very early to assess because, as you well know, these issues changing every day. What we know in terms of tariffs overall is that there will be a welfare loss in the society as a whole, meaning that because of the increasing tariffs, the consumers will be bearing some of those costs that will be affecting countries. But still, we don't have clarity of what will happen. And there are multiple scenarios that could be happening. First, the tariffs never become to a realization. If they become to a realization, it will depend on what will be the response of countries in which tariffs are imposed, if there will be an individual differentiated response, or if there will be an overall response.
Which countries are most vulnerable, do you think?
Look, the countries which will always be the most vulnerable, if these are issues specific to food, will be the import-dependent countries, no? And also, of course, we need to add to that component whatever happens with the currency. Because if those countries face exchange rate devaluations, then of course you will have the price effect plus the devaluation effect.
Now, aside from that major shock, climate change has the power to disrupt how we produce food. What impact could it have, and where might we see that impact?
Yeah, what we need to understand in terms of climate and extreme weather events, which we are observing today, is that we already have violated 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. There are 5 impacts of climate. One is extreme temperatures. The second one is excess of lack of water. The third one is climate variability of indicators, which will make more difficult for farmers to make decisions. The third is pests and diseases that will adapt to climate. And the fifth one is migration of human beings and migration of species. So those are the 5 dimensions. Now, which will be the most vulnerable countries? Of course, the poorest countries will be the most vulnerable. And the answer is simple, is because they have less capacity to be resilient to those changes. They have less income, they are more budget constrained, and they cannot respond earlier to those type of potential changes. And they don't have the information and the quality of institutions and insurance systems in place that will allow them to cope with those type of extremes.
Is technology the answer here? What role will that play in solving some of the challenges when it comes to food production?
Sure, technology could be a solution, of course. As I mentioned, climate will affect in 5 dimensions. Now, to cope with that, we need to increase resilience and how we can make the production of food, of farmers, more resilient. And that's where technology and science-based evidence will make a lot of sense because it will help us to use seeds and varieties which are more weather resistant. And of course, we need to find ways to facilitate trade because that will diversify the portfolio and will minimize the risk. So yes, technology will play a crucial role, but we need to look and the technology should be driven by science. And the major job is how we can make technology inclusive to avoid the poorest to be excluded from those technological advances.
And fundamentally, do you believe that the world has enough food to go around?
The world today has enough calories, but the world today doesn't have enough diversity of foods that we need to have. So in terms of availability of calories, we have. In terms of availability of what we call a healthy diet, which is diversity of food, we are still missing significant production. But that does not mean that we have enough access to food. So the major problem is the lack of access to food. So the food is produced, but is not distributed evenly. And therefore, there is a significant amount of the population in the world that today doesn't have access to food, 733 million people, but also a significant amount of the population that don't have access to healthy diets. More than 2 billion people don't have access to healthy diets.
Máximo Torero-Tulón, it's really good to have you on the programme this week. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.